There we go. We are live.
There we go. We are live. We are back.
We are back after a couple of weeks hiatus. And now the return of the Whiskey and Cigarettes podcast with your hosts, Tina Kilberg and Tim Chessman, sponsored by
Tanya Tanning Butter,
Sterling Cooper and Partners, and
96 MFK Hit Radio Los Angeles.
More music, more groove,
less talk.
All right. And today our subject is long awaited, the one and only man who was born Thomas John Cummer in 1933, otherwise known as Jay Sebring, right here. Boy, we've been looking forward to this one, haven't we?
We really have. Tim and I have been talking about this for the past few weeks, actually. In fact, I think even early on when we started doing these episode series, we just really want to talk about Jay. I think he's one of the most prevalent characters. I'm saying this as I'm looking at the side. Just a few more frames. Framed photos of Jay, who I love very much. And I'm someone who lives in Europe. So I struggled for years to gain access to the Cutting to the Truth documentary, which came out in 2020. And Tim, luckily enough, after trying to send me so many links and ways to watch it, I tried streaming it in the UK, I tried streaming it in Greece, and I tried streaming it in Cyprus because I'm mostly based in these three countries when I'm in Europe. And he managed to record parts and send them to me. And I'm very glad that I got to see this documentary because I made notes.
And that's before we even get much further. That documentary is a must see for anyone who's watching and who is interested in Jay. Most of what we're talking about is informed by the Jay Sebring documentary, Cutting to the Truth, which came out in 2020 and was produced by Jay's nephew, Anthony DiMaria, who is a great guy, a very articulate guy, passionate spokesman for his family and for representing the people who are affected, the victims and the families in the right way. So anyone who's interested, you can watch it in several platforms. It is difficult in Europe, I think. I still don't think you can stream it there. But you can find it on the Tubi network here in the US. I think they're still showing it. I think it's free. Or you can find it here on YouTube, Cutting to the Truth, Jay Sebring. It talks all about Jay. And most important, it focuses on Jay's life, which is the part that is not discussed and which is so interesting. And of the three principles, I think we could probably, our principles for those who've been following along is our upcoming series that Tina's writing and we're working on. The three principles obviously are Terry Melcher, the namesake of the series predominantly, Sharon Tate, who we've covered on a channel here, and then Jay Sebring. And of the three, I would almost say that Jay was the most maligned of any of them and the most misrepresented in the wake of his death. So what we're trying to do here and what we're doing with this episode is just focusing on his life and his remarkable achievements, which aren't talked about enough.
Absolutely. And, you know, before Vidal Sassoon revolutionized women's hair, Jay Sebring, in fact, did the same for men. But his name has largely vanished from cultural conversation. Is this due to the true crime narrative that has overtaken everything? Probably so. But today we kind of want to pull him out of those margins because he wasn't just a hairstylist, which I think what he's remembered for, hairstylist or hairstylist to the stars. And just, you know, briefly attached to a few names of A-list stars at the time. That's what people know about him, more or less. But he was more than that. And this is why I do want people, if they are interested, to take a chance and look into Anthony's documentary, because Jay was a pioneer. He was a brand. He was a visionary. These are things that you're going to realize when watching Cutting to the Truth, because he was someone who transformed hair grooming into an art form and helped shape the masculine image of the 1960s. And the tragedy of his death has often kind of taken away that kind of light and what he's achieved in his life. So we just want to clarify that this episode, just like for the most part, the others, and just in the nature of how, you know, we're developing this series, is that it's not about crime. That's been overdone, and we're not interested in it. This is about Jay Sebring's legacy, his style, and just reclaiming the story of someone who literally gave shape to icons and yet never really received credit for his own. So
no, and that's really well put. That's really well put. And there wasn't, we'll get into it later, but There wasn't a major male film or television star in the 1960s that either didn't know Jay, was Jay's friend, or was Jay's client. And you can reel them off. They were, I mean, all the big ones: Charlton Heston, Marlon Brando, Alex Cord, Bruce Lee, Warren Beatty. Steve McQueen was the big one, which we'll talk about. Quincy Jones, Sammy Davis Jr., Frank Sinatra, Victim, all the list goes on and on. What he was able to accomplish in under a decade is just remarkable. And we'll get into that. And when Tina first approached me about this 4 years ago, the one thing we really bonded over is that we didn't want this to be about crime. I thought it was a fantastic way to approach it. I was honored that she wanted me to play a certain couple of characters in this, which we'll get into later. But the one thing we agreed on way in the beginning, all those years ago, was that this cannot be about true crime, salaciousness, and turning the murders into a cottage industry like so many exploiters have done in the past. And you can run them down. And this is not that. So for anyone who's thinking it's going to be that, I think we've tried to make clear that this is not about that. And if you watch our previous videos, you'll see that this is not a rehashing of the crime. Those people have been given enough attention.
And also something interesting enough, because you did mention this, if there's anything I'd like to mention is that I actually took notes, and I want to quote Anthony DiMaria in a recent interview that he gave, which I think was beautifully said. And I quote, "Sadly, in most true crime, the victims are often aligned, diminished, vilified." Sorry, aligned is a typo. They're almost diminished or vilified. And the reason is the first thing you do when you sell a true tragedy, horrific crimes, is that you strip the victims of humanity. And someone can now package and sell for consumption, sell this content for consumption guilt-free. And that's the formula. So the problem with true crime is that you have the types of consumers who thrive on this, who are just as responsible for thriving off of it and perpetuating this financially. And there's the person who's profiteering from it and the person or people who are consuming it. And something that I really love, which I had to note down, which Anthony mentions, is the only worse than the asshole is the asshole listening to the asshole, or the asshole consuming the shit of the asshole.
Yes.
So and very interesting was that initially what I found interesting was that when he started trying to develop and get the documentary made, there were people that actually offered a critique and told Anthony that he was too close to him, meaning that because he was Jay's nephew, that it might be more biased, I said, or subjective. But if anything, that's the narrative that people are looking for. That's what people are interested in.
Exactly. That's the story that hasn't been told. That's the story that hasn't been told.
Yeah. Who are up for, like he mentioned, for most of them, it's a cash grab. I want to listen to people like Joe Ternueva and Anthony DiMaria, because you guys were close to him. That was literally his uncle, and Joe was Jay's protege. And these guys have such great stories to share about Jay. And it only makes it more interesting. I mean, the reason why I had to take so many notes was because the documentary actually gave me an opportunity to look into Sebring's method and just little details about styling hair, because this is what people need to remember. Jay Sebring was a man ahead of his time.
Oh, way ahead. Oh, absolutely.
If we're talking about, barbers and hairdressers, if we're talking about fashion, cultivating looks, Jim Morrison's iconic hairstyle at the times, which played a large role in shaping and shifting his career out to the public eye and in shaping his public image, but also an identity. Jay's methods redefined masculinity, should I say, long before the world was ready for it. And I think our job, with Tim, not just as artists or as researchers looking into him, but as people who also care about truth, which is why we've created this kind of episode segment, podcast, should I say, is that we want to lift those names back up. And Jay was one of them. And to just remember that Jay didn't just cut hair, he carved out a movement And today we just want to remember him in his own terms. And thankfully, due to
that's beautifully
and
put.
guys like Joe and Anthony giving interviews, we're able to make that happen.
The thing about Jay too is the more you look, if you go beyond the mass media portrayals of Jay, however it is, whether it's in the true crime documentaries or even Quentin's movie, which we love, but if you even go beyond that and look into the real person, you cannot help but like this guy. You just cannot help but like him. And that kind of tells us why. As Quentin alluded, and Quentin Tarantino does an interview in Jay's documentary, and he even says this. He goes, why was it that this guy earned the trust of all these big shot actors? I mean, you heard me rattle off the names, and that's just a few. The A-listers all went to Jay. Jay did Jim Morrison's hair for the first Doors record because the Elektra Records wanted him to look that a certain way. And Jay was responsible for that look that you see on the cover of the first Doors record, which I should have grabbed again, but I didn't. But most people will know that record and Jim Morrison's look. Jay Sebring did that. So the reason that he was able to become this, kind of master to the stars is that people liked him. And that's what Quentin said. He did a great job, did a great haircut. Okay. But they just dug him. They dug him because he was a cool guy and he could be trusted. And he was very, very careful about protecting the privacy of his clients because all of his clients were, or many of them, and he worked with people behind the scenes too, but his most prominent clients were the big actors of the 60s. And he took many steps to prevent breakages of their privacy while he was servicing them. So he made all his employees, swear to keep whatever they heard in the shop, which we'll get into the evolution of the shop in a little bit, to keep that confidential. He didn't want them talking to the press, gossip sheets and all that were big back then. Jay was very careful.
Yeah, and Jay avoided gossip columnists as well who try to hit him up. I mean,
integrity. He had a lot of integrity.
Yeah, I didn't complete listening. I only listened to the first part of the interview that Joe gave, but I managed to complete Anthony's full interview, both parts. And what he mentions, and these are just little details that I'm interested in, which is why I love hearing these stories. It's that he mentions, so he had clients that he was cutting their hair that no one knew, that they were wearing a hairpiece, or that some actor colored his hair, or that so-and-so was having an affair. And Jay was at the center of all of these people. He wasn't interesting or relevant because he was a celebrity hairstylist. When people saw him, he was a star among the stars.
Right.
He knew how to express himself and had a high regard for quality. A woman, a car, a quality, expressing yourself. And he was extremely private with customers.
If you look at pictures of Jay, even for back then, when the style of dress was much more formal, Jay was almost always dressed to the nines. I mean, Jay made it a habit to look good because he was selling himself as well as his services and his products. That's why he drove cars. He wore nice clothes. He was always impeccably groomed. He was charismatic. And, he was one of those guys that women loved him and men wanted to be him. He was just one of those kind of guys. And he was a good person. The more you learn about him, as Anthony says in that interview, the recent one that Tina's talking about, he was prepared to learn negatives if that was in fact the case. He said, I had to know the truth even if I didn't like it. But what he found was the more he dug into this, and the documentary was like a 10-year project, maybe more. And he's also working to release a book too, which is coming out sometime this summer in the United States to accompany he was prepared to learn the salacious dark side if there was one. He goes, I just wanted to know, because he had been so misrepresented and so demonized. Like we say, don't demonize, don't deify. Well, in the wake of the crimes, the press demonized all the victims and made it look like it was their fault. And like I said, Jay probably more than any of them. He was made to look like a freak, a weirdo, some kind of weird religious occultist with all these dark BDSM habits and all that stuff. He was made to look like he was broke, that he was dealing drugs, all this stuff that the media put out. And those narratives have kind of hung around all these decades later. And, Anthony, being part of that family who's had to deal with this for 6 decades almost, wanted to learn the truth. And he was prepared to find out the bad stuff if there was. But what he said was, the more he looked into Jay, the more he found that none of that was true. And that he was just a very likable, good guy. And in the documentary, there are more than a few people who testify to that, from Joe Torrenueva or Larry Geller, his first protege, who went on to be Elvis's stylist for the last 15 years of his life.
Yeah.
None of that rang true to those people. What the narratives put out by the mass media, particularly in the wake of the crimes, about him being some kind of a degenerate. And as Anthony says in the
Also,
interview, yeah,
and also all of that, unfortunately, it takes away everything about Jay's identity and what he was actually remembered for by his peers when he was alive, because he was pioneering a new industry, and that's why he always looked so sharp, because he was the first to open a men's salon in America. So he had to, I guess, emulate that. Before Jay came along, I believe the documentary mentions that a barbershop was just 5 chairs in a row and 5 guys cutting badly.
Cutting bad hair. And Jay wasn't a barber. Jay wasn't a barber. That's a big part of it too. He had to battle the barbers union because
and we have to get into that.
He was a
he started men's hairstyling movement. So
right. He was a cosmetologist for men, really, which butted heads with the barbers union, because he was able to charge these extremely high prices even for the 60s. And the barbers who were charging $2 didn't like that. And we can get into that too.
Well, what's very interesting is that so shampooing men's hair was actually unheard of at the time, and he helped introduce a new kind of grooming culture. And I think
particularly in America, that wasn't done in the States.
Yes. So I think also he saw hair as the frame of the face, which I believe is what he mentions in a video clip in the documentary. So he prioritized face shape, bone structure, and personal image. And what's very interesting is that from the notes that I did make, he would see what would vibe into what looked good for your face and give you the cut that you were geometrically. And he says
he was a craftsman.
Jay says everyone is looking for the same shape, but the most important thing is the outline, the hair as the frame of the face. So when he created the look for men in the 60s, it eventually became difficult for months. And within months, it was difficult to get an appointment with him. So
he became a very big deal very quickly. Very quickly.
Sure.
Now, if you want to, we might want to start because as we've said privately, the 3 principals of the series, Jay, Sharon, and Terry, of the 3, Jay's rise to fame was probably the most improbable, because if only for the fact that he had no connections at all. He wasn't a Nepo baby. He wasn't famous. He wasn't born into fame. He wasn't born in California to all these connections. He made it basically through sheer will and guts and tenacity. So it's kind of interesting if we start at the beginning and kind of talk about how his life evolved. So as I mentioned at the beginning, he was born Tom Comer. He was not born Jay Sebring. He changed that later. He was born in Alabama, moved from Alabama, I think when he was just a baby, age 2 or 3, to Detroit, Michigan, where he actually grew up. Spent his formative years in Detroit. The house he grew up in, I think, as the documentary said, is now gone, but the lot is still there. He joined the Navy right out of high school, which seemed like a kind of a crazy move for him because he was so much of an individualist. But he went to the Navy, served 4 years. I think it was 50 to 54. Came out and then didn't quite know what to do. And he started cutting hair for his friends in the Navy, as the documentary said. And even then, without any formal training, his cuts were so much better than what the Navy was giving at the time, which doesn't say a whole lot, but they were much better than that. It dawned on him that maybe he should try to do this. So he came home to Detroit, tried to stay there a little while, and just couldn't get anything going, didn't feel right. And then he told his parents, you know what, I'm going to California. I'm going to LA, and I'm going to pursue cosmetology, meaning the ability to do style, shape, and cut hair. Now, I'm not lost on the irony that I'm talking about men's hair, but I'm going to do it anyway. So he would cut and style the hair, like Tina said, in a way that was very revolutionary for the United States, especially. I think they were doing some of that in Europe, but in the US, nobody did what Jay did. So he went to cosmetology school for a couple of years. And then in March, I think it was March of 59, he opened the shop, the flagship hair salon on Fairfax Avenue in West Hollywood, which you can look up pictures. It's still there, although it has been bought, and I think it's under the threat of being demolished now. But for now, it's still there. as is the apartment above the shop where Jay had his offices and where he lived for a time when he was just first starting out. But that's where he got his start. He rented that space with money he borrowed from his dad, from the little that he had saved up, and he was flat ass broke. I mean, he did not just jump in, with a bunch of family money or Nepo money and open a salon. He was in there 24/7 doing most of the work, the shelving setups, the sinks, all the plumbing, all himself, just to get ready to cut hair. And then his big break happened with Victim Own. And I don't know if you remember that, but you might want to talk about that too.
Well, what's very interesting is that he had an eye for transformation, because I think all of his clients, they were so impressed by the fact that Jay's cuts made people feel like a new person.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I really love from the documentary is that I can't remember who said it, but someone said at some point, I wish, because they were talking about how he was charging, $50 for a cut. And someone says, I wish I could spend $50 and get him to do it again.
That was Andy Williams, the singer.
Right.
I think since that interview has passed, but yeah, he was one of Jay's first.
Well, that's amazing. But also, I loved actually finally being able to learn like the little details. And this is why I kind of want to look into Joe as well and what Joe has said, because he was Jay's protege. And
he was one of the original.
Yes. And I think it would be good because I think it would be so much more informative to actually really look in and get introspective and see, well, what was it about the Sebring method? And there's just different, and you can actually gain insight on how this man viewed things. I mean, when he says he would get the hair wet after the shampoo, and that's important for the client. So you, as someone who's styling the hair, in those tutorial videos that he put out, won't be influenced by how his hair was styled before.
Yeah.
And he mentions 3 things that he pays attention to: the shape of his face, the structure of his hair when you're dealing with your client, and his position in life, which I found fascinating, because that just makes you more creative, I guess, when you're looking into who you're styling things for. But
is the audio okay on your end?
Fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's some interference in there somewhere. I'm not sure if it's your end or mine. Now it seems okay. Maybe it's the moving of the papers.
I'm hoping there's no interference, but if there is, I'll go through the points again.
Okay, no, that was good. And we should probably point out that he didn't just show up and start charging $500 for a haircut, which in today's money is more like $4,000. Okay, so. But I think it was the documentary where he said that Jay's big break came when his girlfriend at the time, Barbara Luna, who was an actress back then, and who helped Jay get the shop set up, brought in the singer and the actor Victim Own, who was so happy with the job that Jay did because of all the things that Tina just mentioned, paying his attention to those 3 principles that she mentioned: shape of the face, position in life, and structure of the hair. He was so happy with that haircut that he gave him $100. Now, this is 1959, okay? March of 59 or so. $100 back then is like $1,000 now. So the guy, and probably in Beverly Hills and places, that's cheap for a haircut. But back then, no one did that, especially for men. So Victim Own gave him $100, the equivalent of $1,000. And then Vic introduced him to other big shots, Jack and Trotter of the Sands Hotel. And through Jack, he met Frank Sinatra. Once he met Sinatra, his star couldn't rise fast enough because Frank liked him. Frank liked the job he did. And Frank was sensitive about his hair because it was thinning. So he had to have, just the right kind of perfect cut. And Sinatra was thrilled with the job Jay did. After Sinatra gave him an endorsement, there was no end to it. And then within a couple of years, he was off and running. And a good port in we're only talking about like 59 to 69. Just what he did in that decade, he rose from flat broke to the most famous men's hairstylist probably in the world, without a doubt in the United States. All within 10 years.
Yeah, and he didn't just style for the sake of function and men's beauty or whatever, but he also styled for film. He designed a haircut specifically for a character in a movie, and he'd get sent off to Vegas or wherever it was. I believe every few weeks for a particular actor.
That was Sinatra. Sinatra flew him out if Sinatra was in Vegas, He'd fly Jay out to Vegas every few weeks to cut his hair. Sinatra was meticulous in everything he did, from his music to his appearance to his clothes to his haircut to his skin, all of it. Meticulous. I mean, he was almost probably OCD if you want to diagnose him that. So if Jay made a guy like that happy, Jay was going to make everybody happy.
Yeah. And he also
Jay
trained
actually
Joe Torrenueva to go and cut, I believe, even Bruce Lee's hair. I believe, I'm not sure if it was Bruce Lee, but he would go to Vegas with Joe and he would introduce them to people, and Joe would, you know, cut people's hair, you know, on behalf of Jay. So they trusted him and they trusted his input. So Joe was a great addition for that. And I believe they worked together around 61 and around 66. Joe started creating his own products.
I think so, yeah, right around in there.
They still remain to be very good friends, and Joe was actually with him at the Factory, which was a nightclub, on the Wednesday that week before. Unfortunately,
he did say that.
A week
just to kind of put in perspective, you know, how fast his rise was. You know, 59, he opens the shop. He was flat broke. He'd spent all his money trying to get this shop ready and spending money to lease the shop. By 61, as the documentary shows, he was on the game show To Tell the Truth as the most famous men's hairstylist in the country. So that's a period of 2 years. So after Vic Damone got his haircut and liked it, and then Sinatra gave him his endorsement, Jay was off and running. And before you know it, he was flying all over the place, charging $2,000 for a haircut in the 60s, which is more like 15 grand now. So I mean, he was a mover and a shaker. And like Tina said, he was a visionary, and he doesn't get enough credit for it. He really doesn't.
And I think it's just amazing how now, especially with hopefully Anthony's book coming out over the summer, we'll just be able to explore more stories and learn more about him, because I think a big issue is that I think everyone just wants the salaciousness, and that's not what I'm interested in. You know, I didn't complete listening to Joe's interview, but when I did, what made me very upset was that he mentions that a lot of the people, they're not actually interested in giving Joe an interview. They just want to see his photos, his collections. They want to know salacious gossip about celebrities and famous people. And I think that's so, I mean, that wouldn't be the case for someone like Tim and I, because even if you and I never really got an opportunity to interview Anthony or Joe, I would love to reach out to both of these guys nonetheless, because I just know that they have a lot of great stories. And I think even privately having discussions and me sending them like scenes and scene packs of Jay to make sure like they'd approve, if it's realistic, if they have any stories to share. And now, sorry, I think my camera disappeared for a minute. I'm not sure if
it's okay now. It only went out about seconds. Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
You're
Cheers. Good. So I think Joe Torrenueva is also a great additional character in the series, because that's the type of relationship I want to explore, him working with Jay, the little things. And I finally discovered members of the International Hair Designers Guild, which
Jay founded.
Sorry, my camera keeps disappearing.
Okay, it's okay again now. We're on opposite sides.
I'm hoping it's good.
So it get a little tough. Yeah, it's okay now.
Yeah.
Well, the other one too, I think, who is still alive is Larry Geller, who was I think he's still alive too. He was, I think, actually Jay's first protege. He tells a great story in the documentary about meeting Jay, which you might remember. He said he had just graduated from cosmetology school himself and was going to go work on women's hair. He was walking down Fairfax Avenue in sometime in 59. He saw Jay's shop and had like the stained glass window and looked kind of different for back then. He walks in, Jay was in there holding a plant, and they just started chatting. And Larry just told him his story, and Jay at that point already knew. Yeah, and he already knew at that point what he wanted to do. He's like, hey man, we're going to do men's hair. There's enough people doing women's hair. We're going to be visionaries. We're going to set a whole new standard for an industry. He knew even then what he wanted to do. And Larry said, hey man, yeah, I'm all aboard. And then he became Jay's first protege. And I think Joe came shortly after that. But so many people went through his shop there and apprenticed with Jay and learned the method, and then branched out on their own. And then that's where he got into trouble with the Barbers Union, because the Barbers Union wanted to shut him down because he didn't have a barber license.
Correct.
He had a cosmetology.
Yes, that's what I did want to mention, because I think, well, what we have to give them credit for is that these guys made men's hairstyling a luxurious experience.
Mhm.
Getting, I'm guessing head massages were like prominent and included in that service too. Because what I didn't realize was that for barbers, they didn't even wash your hair. Like they
No,
wouldn't wash
nobody,
your
and
hair.
now it's standard practice, even
I
and
never
standard practice for men and
even know
women everywhere.
that. Yeah. And
Nobody did that before Jay for men. Nobody went
yeah,
to those little touches before Jay. And Jay's shop, when he set that up, if I'm not mistaken, in the descriptions of it, in the books and things that cover it, it was a classy place. I mean, you'd walk in, he'd have coffee going, there'd be movie magazines laying out so that the clients could read about their reviews and everything. There were records playing. It was a comfortable place to be. There was no paparazzi around. Press was not allowed inside unless Jay had given them direct permission to be there. So they could come in there and they could relax. Even in the back of the salon, I think there was a private parking area. There was actually a valet cab stand where someone would greet the customer and then park their car behind the shop so that anyone who was in front of the shop wouldn't be tipped off that, oh, there's Steve McQueen's Jaguar. He must be there. Let's go try to take a picture of him. So he would have them park in the back oftentimes so that they could be incognito as they came in. He took care of all that little stuff, which again is why I think people trusted him, because he knew that he was going to safeguard their privacy.
And it's also just exciting just seeing all these clips of Jay actually being alive and like moving through the hair salon. And it's just, all these clips are perfect because that's what I kind of want to follow through. I want to follow through his life and see all of these things, and just watch him at work. But because you did mention the issue with the barbers and stuff, what's very interesting is that Joe mentions in his interview that they kind of formed, like I mentioned, this guild-like union, a union, Hair Design International Hair
In
Design.
response to the union, in response to the barbers
Yeah.
union,
Right.
they
And they
petitioned.
were actually
No,
able
yeah.
to get a bill passed. They were
Yes.
actually able to get a bill passed in Sacramento, California. And they said that if you were a hairdresser, or a cosmetologist like Joe and Jay, and had been working for like X amount of time or just a specific amount of time, you were allowed to take a barber test without going to school,
Right.
provided that you passed it. So Joe mentions that they actually opened it up for all the barbers to work at the same space as a hairdresser.
Mm-hmm.
And I quote, so today barbers can work in the same room as a cosmetologist. Back then you couldn't.
Right.
So I never, so it's just little things that's very interesting. And I think, like you did mention, the issue with the barbers was that because they were charging more money at that time and giving more haircuts, like the barbers didn't like that. But I think,
No, they
like
were charging multiple rates higher than what a barber would charge.
yeah, but for them, it's not, they weren't taking business for them. They were just elevating, like he mentions, a
He
whole
did,
level of
yeah.
hair.
Elevating
They
the profession. That was a big thing with Jay. He talked about that a lot. He wanted to elevate the profession, and he did. As the documentary said, in I think 2018 or 19, the men's hairstyling industry worldwide generated $20 billion.
Wow.
An industry that would not have existed in the way we know it today without Jay. And that's nobody talks about that stuff. And another point the documentary made was that one of his friends who was interviewed said back when Jay was really going in the 60s, he was a very big deal. Anybody who was anybody knew who Jay was. If you were a man, you were either a friend or a client or both. If you were a woman, you were in his orbit. And he was a very big deal. He wasn't a big deal in the public eye because he worked kind of behind the scenes. But any insider, anybody who was anybody on the inside of the entertainment business knew who Jay was and respected Jay. So he was a very big deal. And he also Bruce Lee's biographer and his wife, as the documentary talks about, gave Jay credit for basically starting Bruce Lee's film career, because William Dozier, who was a big producer at the time in LA, was looking for an Asian actor who was good looking and fit and could speak English well. And Jay gave him Bruce's name. Bruce did a screen test, and then Bruce got the role as Kato in The Green Hornet, and then his career exploded. And Jay kind of started that. Jay referred him to the producer, William Dozier, and then Bruce Lee's career took off. So they stayed close. through their entire lives. And then probably the most famous of Jay's clients and friends was Steve McQueen. And I have this picture here. We got a bunch of pictures to show, but this is one of my favorite pictures of Jay. This is Jay. If you can see this, can you see that kind of?
I can see it perfectly.
This is Jay cutting Steve McQueen's hair in the private room of Fairfax Avenue in the salon, probably sometime in 64, 65. And you can see this is a little private area where the most famous clients would go, that Jay could give them special treatment and not have them worried about being exposed to photographers or paparazzi. And Steve was one of Jay's best friends for his entire life. And I think even in one of the books, Steve quotes, there's a quote by Steve saying that Jay was one of my best friends. And he and Quincy Jones and Jay were very close at one time, went out together, partied together, went to movies together, hit the scene together. So he was friends with, these were not only his clients, but many of them were his friends. And again, because they dug him and he did a good job.
Yeah.
And the more you learn about him, the more there is to like. And there were stories. I think Dennis Hopper told a story about him giving haircuts for free. If clients were going through a bad time and couldn't afford to pay, he'd do it for nothing. Do little favors for people. I mean, he was a stand-up guy. He really was. He wasn't a freak. He wasn't a degenerate. He was a visionary. He laid the seeds for an industry that has continued to grow today and now generates billions of dollars, largely due to the changes that he made and brought about.
And also, I just think that all these, clickbait titles and things that, kind of showcase Jay in a negative light. I don't know if it just has to do with the salaciousness, but it's just not necessary. And I think a few things should not be in the public domain or discussed. But there were a lot of horrible stories, unfortunately, because I think that's what all of them were looking for. Is maybe, like Anthony did mention, it strips away the victim's humanity if you're able to entertain this crazy idea that these people deserve to die or whatever,
right?
Because
that was the implication for a long
basis, which it just wasn't the case. And I believe when he was speaking to James Gunn, I believe is his name, worked in LAPD. He worked in the narcotics division, and this isn't in the documentary, but it's in an interview that Anthony recently gave. And a great takeaway from that was that around that time, they would do a lot of research and they would pick things up. And this guy never came across the name Jay Sebring. He actually says, I've never heard the name Jay Sebring. And so I believe if he was involved in that sort of intensity, even with the drug dealing and stuff, and it's something that I do have to look into, because there's a lot of conflicting evidence, but then you actually have to take a closer look and look at the evidence and realize there's actually a lack of evidence, and everything is alleged. But if we keep reproducing articles and stories based on these alleged facts, we take them as truth, which I believe is where we begin to limit people when it comes to their legacy. Because I believe for years, it just went unnoticed for me, where I just read so many articles, and there was so much content on Jay being involved in drug dealing and stuff. And I had to actually take a step back and realize, oh, this is actually all alleged. And Tim actually helped me with that, because he did mention, try and stay away from this narrative because it's alleged. It's not actually a fact. And I should encourage you to watch the documentary. So that really helped, because I had to actually look back at all the notes I saved over the years and realize that, oh, all of this is actually alleged. But you see it so much.
And it's alleged, a lot of it going right back to the time after the crimes. The documentary points out this Time magazine article that came out in late August of '69 that it had no credited author, and Anthony tried to determine who wrote this thing. Time magazine wouldn't get back to him, wouldn't tell him anything, which is shady.
That's crazy. I remember
and
that
basically
part.
That article, it's horrible. In Time, I've not read it, but it's in Time, and it basically demonizes and maligns all the victims, painting them as freaks and deserving of what happened to them. And that kind of stuff carried over for decades, especially when it came to Jay, because his reputation was never really restored to its proper place. The rumors of drug dealing and being broke and all that stuff has followed him all these decades later. And we'll probably get to in that recent interview that Anthony did, he uncovered bank records showing that Jay was not broke. And that was a big thing. Oh, Jay couldn't handle money. Jay spent money. Jay was in debt, blah, blah, blah. He found bank records for his uncle that showed that he had in excess of $380,000 worth of assets at the time of death. That's in 60s money. So now you're talking about close to $4 million in today's money. He says there are bank records to show that he had this much cash on hand, stocks, whatever else, property worth this much money. So that shoots that down. And then the other allegation is, the drug dealing. And like you said, there's no police record of his name ever having come up. And why, in his position, would you jeopardize your clients and yourself, your well-being, your future, and your own reputation for dealing drugs? Now, let's be realistic. It was the 60s. Drugs were everywhere. LSD, man. Is it possible that he shared LSD with some of his friends? Of course. It was the 60s. Try finding one celebrity who didn't have LSD. I think even Dominic Dunn says that, yeah, he did share LSD once with Jay, but so what? Everybody did that in the 60s, especially the celebrities. That doesn't mean he was a dealer, but that's that stuff that's the overhang from the salaciousness of the aftermath of the crimes. And it's very unfair to Jay. It's very unfair to his family, to Sharon's family, and to the families of everyone else involved. It really is.
Also, another thing that Anthony actually addresses is that there were a lot of misunderstandings that his friends, that some of his friends were giving him money as loans, but that actually wasn't the case. And I believe when he looked into it, he realized that they were actually investing in his business.
Yes.
And I don't know if we could say the same for this. So this is a letter from in 1965 that Sharon Tate writes to her talent agency and her agents, I guess. So I just have a printed copy where it's she's asking for money to be transferred to Jay's hair salon. So if I just quickly read it out, because I do want to mention that this might be interpreted as another sign of like him being in debt or whatever, but maybe that wasn't the case. And maybe Sharon was one of the many friends and people close to him that was trying to help him with his business. And I do want to get back to that in a minute because well, something that she says is in this letter, gentlemen, as an accommodation to me, I request that all monies which you may receive on my account be paid after deduction of any commissions payable to you by me to and in the name of Thomas J. Sebring at Sebring's International, 725 North Fairfax Avenue, Los Angeles, California, 90046. You shall not be held responsible or in any way accountable for the disposition by Mr. Sebring of such funds. Your responsibility with regard to such funds shall end when a check payable to Mr. Sebring has been either delivered to him personally or deposited in the U.S. mail addressed to him as indicated above. And then she just mentions this authorization shall remain in full force and in effect until you receive other instructions from me in writing. Very truly yours, Sharon Tate. So this is just an example for money being transferred. And I believe it just goes to show that it had to do with investing, because what a lot of people don't know, and I don't know if this was mentioned in the documentary, but it was mentioned in an interview that Anthony eventually gave, was that Jay was working with chemists in the early 60s, I believe. And they were trying to develop a product line that was organic and pH balanced. And I believe
way
this was
back
from
then, way back then
60.
when nobody was doing that.
Yes. So hiring chemists to develop this organic pH balance, an entire product line in his own name. So we know that Jay there were a lot of products with the Ank logo, which was Jay's logo. But also that, Jay was open to the idea because he had never launched his own product line until now. And he was open to this idea because there were two guys, Raymond Lee from the Layette Company and Jerry Reading, who created Redken Labs. These people had product lines. So when they learned about what Jay was trying to do, they wanted to approach him.
He turned them down, right? He decided he wanted on his own.
Yes. He eventually launched the entire product line in 1966, but on his own. And I quote, because with all the investing since late 1961 until the release of it, that would be diluting his profit line. And he decided to go at it alone. And he mentions that these were the supposed business dealings that were falling through, trying to feed this narrative that he was in debt. So even this letter from 1965, it's these little things that kind of go to show that people were investing in him because they believed in him.
Well, and that's a really good find. I didn't even know that existed till that's really cool. And when we know for a fact that Jay had investors lined up over the summer of '69 at the Cielo house when Sharon and Roman were in Europe, where a lot of sketchy things may have happened in their absence. One thing that did happen that Jay had gotten permission for was he held an investors meeting at Cielo for prospective clients and investors into Sebring International. He held a meeting for them at Cielo over that summer with Roman and Sharon's permission to have everyone meet there, and so he could go over a business plan with potential investors. That happened sometime over that summer while they were gone. We also know that he had been preparing to open a satellite shop in San Francisco on Commercial Street. And some of the early investors there were Abigail Folger and Colonel Paul and Doris Tate were also early investors in Jay's business. Jay stayed close to Sharon's parents for the rest of his life. I think he was friends with them till the end. He thought a lot of them and they thought a lot of him. And he was always in Sharon's life in some form or another till the end of their lives. So it makes sense that they would have wanted to invest in his businesses. And that satellite shop was a big deal. He was, in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, he was due to fly to San Francisco either the day after he died or the couple days after to finalize plans to open that satellite shop and start another division of Sebring International there. He didn't get the chance to do that, obviously. That does make sense. And going at it alone with his product line ultimately would have made it more profitable, because I think, as his partner Jim Markham says in the documentary, he had talked with Jay many times over the years, and they had agreed that the product line was really the future of the business, the big revenue source of the business going forward. And they turned out to be right, because the product line lasted many, many years longer than the Sebring shops and the main shop there on Fairfax in the wake of Jay's death. So that didn't fold until, I think, a couple decades later. So his instincts were right about that. He was right to go it alone there.
Yeah. I mean, also, I think another thing is that if I, quickly go back to the pH balance that he was trying to create when he was working with chemists in late 1961, was that you have to remember that to get that sorted, you have to get it passed by the FDA or whichever government is like agency or whatever is responsible.
Probably the FDA, yeah.
Probably the FDA, right? So Jay was actually putting a lot of his own money back into his own enterprise.
Almost all of it in the beginning, at least. Yeah.
And with the product line, like you mentioned with San Fran, he was expanding to San Francisco and New York City. He was going to open in New York City, and he wanted to even expand to Europe, London.
Yeah, he had his eyes on London, and I think even Hawaii at one point. His plans were big, and as much as he had accomplished in those 10 years, his plans went way beyond that. And here, this picture here, since you mentioned it, this is something I printed. This is a copy of an early advertisement in magazines for Jay's products. That's Jay there, and it shows a couple of the products here, and it's like it says now in Los Angeles' finest stores, the Sebring line of products for men's fine hair styling and hair care. So this was an ad. Yeah, I'm not sure when this came out, probably late 60s.
I love that so much, and I also love there's cool. Also there's another press coverage that I found where it just says in a large heading, "Would you pay $50 for a haircut?" Yes, I would. And like that client said from the documentary, where I wish I could go back and pay $50 and he could cut my hair again. I think that's really how Jay ought to be remembered.
Absolutely. This is just while we're talking, this is not a great picture. It's not a great copy, but this is Jay in front of the salon on Fairfax. Yeah, that's Jay from the Batman TV show. That was cool. This was early. This was probably 61 or 2. This is Jay here, and again, not the best picture, but you can see them. They're in front of the Sebring Salon on Fairfax Avenue, which Tarantino actually did create for the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but we didn't really see it in the movie. It's him with a bunch of his earliest team members. There's Gordon Mullinger, his first secretary back there, and the people who started with him in the beginning. So yeah, that was outside the flagship salon on Fairfax, which before he found the famous house on Easton Drive, which we can talk about, he lived in a little apartment building above that shop while he was roughing it, trying to get everything ready. And then in '63, he found the house on Easton Drive, which is also an interesting story about the history of that house.
Yeah. I mean, I do have the thread pulled up.
Mm-hmm.
I have the thread pulled up from his home. I don't know if I want to get into it too much, but if I just have to summarize it in some way, it was a beautiful Bavarian-styled house in Benedict Canyon, and Paul Byrne actually had that home and lived with his wife. And
Dean Harlow, yeah.
So this house, without mentioning too much about the home, because I do want to keep this episode on a lighter note and only end things on a lighter note, but Jay was fascinated with this home because of its dark history. And even when he was showing guys around, I believe even Larry actually, Larry?
Larry
So
Geller, yeah, told the story.
There were 3 more people that died at this home. There were people that died at this home, and there was a place where Paul Byrne died, and he showed that spot. And there was even a suicide note that he left. But not to mention that Larry Geller, who originally worked for Sebring, recalled that when Jay bought the property and gave him a tour, he showed him the bathroom where Paul Byrne's body had been found and said, quote, "When I go, the whole world's going to know about it," end quote.
Yeah, that's kind of...
So I know that the documentary briefly touches on the subject. I believe someone mentions that he was psychic or whatever. But I think this is what I want to say. I think Jay just generally had good taste, and it was a beautiful home. Let's not deny that it was a beautiful home.
And it's still there. It looks almost exactly the same.
Yes. I do want to mention that Sharon Tate eventually gave an interview with Dick Kleiner, I believe 3 years before she passed, where she did mention she had a psychic experience, or should I say paranormal experience, if that's the correct term, without delving into esoteric subjects too much. Maybe David Oman would be someone great to talk to about this and his experience at Cielo, but given that he built a home there with his dad. She says, "I have had psychic experiences, at least I guess that's what it was, and it was a terribly frightening and disturbing thing for me. It happened a year ago or so. Maybe you can explain it." 1968 was when she gave this interview, or 1967, when she says a year ago, so it must have been 67 or 66. So in this interview, she kind of goes to mention, and people have recalled the story several times, where Sharon sees a kind of premonition of Jay's throat being slashed.
I don't think it was Jay, it was just the guy. And that story was that it could have been Paul Byrne. She had this vision of Paul Byrne.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
But they kind of found that story intriguing.
For instance, has debunked this.
Yeah. The house is cool. It looks like you're frozen there a little bit.
Just 1 minute, because my connection is not good. Hold on.
Audio is still good.
Are you here?
Yeah, I hear you. I'm here. There you go. You're good. You're back. Yeah.
I'm just gonna try and close all tabs.
Okay.
And see if this is okay.
The thing about Jay's house,
the connection's good.
Jay's house is still there, and unlike a lot of things in LA where the tendency is to tear down anything old, we saw that with the house that Sharon and Terry lived on, Cielo Drive. That's been gone for 30 years. Jay's house is still there, and I think that's because it's only had one owner since Jay died. His family sold it to a couple, and if they don't still own it, I think their family still owns it. So it hasn't really been touched. Easton is a very small road, and you can't see the house from the road. You can just see the gate. But Jay's house looks almost exactly like it did when Jay lived there. It's painted the same. It has the same kind of shrubbery and foliage and around it. The pool's the same. So it's kind of frozen in time. And he liked that about that house. It was hidden away. It wasn't a big place, but it was tastefully done. It was built during Prohibition. You can look up pictures of Jay's. You just look up Jay Sebring house. Yeah, there it is, if you can see that. Yeah, that's what it still looks like today. That's at the bottom of Benedict
this
Canyon.
is the thread that kind of analyze his home.
Yeah, that's good.
So it's you
that
just type in history of Jay Sebring's old home, 9860 Eastern Drive, a thread considering the tenants who live there and their contributions to the energy of the home. So without delving into the dark, okay, my camera's back. Not having the best connection here, but hopefully we managed to talk about all the good stuff. We have mentioned this in the past with Tim. I do believe that it's good to look into the energy of homes and buildings because buildings carry energy of people that have roamed through them and walked through them. That's why it's very important for us to keep our house clean. And if there's a story that we can take from Sharon and from Jay, it's to just be very careful of who you invite into your home and that sort of thing. So, and Jay himself did mention that he chose this home because he was obsessed with its dark history and loved it so much. So I'd go into more detail.
And it's a cool house. It is kind of frozen in time. And it's funny that the people who owned it after Jay died live there and may still live there. They'd be old now, but I think it's the family. They said they never had any kind of disturbing encounters or feelings in that house.
That's fair. But the thing is, the reason why I've analyzed Jay's home and Cielo Drive in itself is because I do believe that when you live in a place, it does carry the energy of people who previously lived there. You know, Paul Byrne's wife died at the age of 26. So did Sharon Tate. Now, it's not necessarily, it could be a coincidence, but even the way Jay was living in a home and you could say, was orbiting around the energy of Paul Byrne and what this man lived and his karma. So I think with me, I see it more in the sense of, I do believe that home carries a sort of karma, especially from the people that previously lived there. And this is why, you know, despite true crime fanatics, generally here in Europe, I don't know how it's like in Los Angeles, where they'll instantly buy a true crime house for millions of dollars. Here, if we hear that someone got murdered into a house, we are reluctant to buy it. And I think it would be really hard to even lease it or rent it out. We do take these things into account. And so I do think it's good to kind of look into the karma of a place. But I believe that Fairfax Avenue, that store, Sebring International, probably carries the best energy and a lot of good stories. And I'm really glad, Tim, that you mentioned the little situation with the car park, like the secret parking behind for his clients, so they wouldn't get stalked by gossip columnists or whoever it was, or photographers, because it's these little details which are going to make Jay's scenes as part of the series more enticing. And this is really why I'm looking forward to not only finishing Joe's interview and just see anything he's said in relation to Jay, but also getting a copy of Anthony's book, so we can finally look into these stories and show these stories, because this is what we're interested in. And Tim and I, we're not showing any crime scenes in this series. It's been overdone and it's just not necessary. And
that was another thing we agreed on really early on, is that we don't want the gore as part of this. I mean, look at all the stuff we've talked. This is the stuff that very few people know. And the only reason we know this is because we bothered to look past the salacious stuff that always gets talked about. And that's why people who were close to Jay were so shocked that all this, you know, dark, salacious, macabre stuff was coming out in the wake of his death. Like that's not the guy they knew. Like Joe and Larry, like they didn't know, they never saw that. They didn't see him selling drugs. I mean, it would have been ludicrous, again, for him to jeopardize his position in life to sell drugs when he clearly didn't have to. And at the time of his death, according to Anthony, he had plenty of money and he had investors in his businesses. And he was like, and I'm not sure how true this is, but I think it was the Greg King book that said on the Monday after he died, it was I think the 11th or 12th or 13th of August of '69. He was due to sign a new will, which was going to leave Jim Markham, his business partner, in charge of Sebring International in the event of something happening to him. He never got a chance to sign that document.
That's interesting, because I know that from Joe Ternueva's side, I believe on that Monday that must have been for something else. That Monday he went after he passed the kind of the barber test. He had both licenses and could hire barbers and cosmetologists to work all in the same room.
Right.
So that was
Jay did that. That was Jay's lobbying and Jay's activity on the political end to try to get that change made. And that's something that still stands today. Had he not taken those steps back then, who knows what the condition of that industry would be in now, particularly on the men's side. And he did a good job. He was trustworthy and people liked him. I mean, women liked him, men liked him. He was a likable guy. And the documentary kind of goes into what his day looked like. It shows footage. It was really cool. He pulls up to the shop in his Porsche. He's got the little glasses on. He's in his suit.
Yes.
And he gets up, runs upstairs to his little office, finds out what's going on that day, and then runs down like Henry Fonda's waiting there or some big shot.
I love that.
Yeah, so he just knew how to handle
well. It was smoking a cigarette indoors and stuff.
Oh yeah.
I love that so much. I love these little clips and these stories because this is what matters. And and something that people should know is that Tim and I were really looking forward to doing this episode because we love Jay very much. We've loved him for many years. We've been talking about him for many years. And you know what? I think also with Quentin, I'm really glad that he participated and spoke in this documentary, because I think the more and more I look into it, I'm realizing that Tarantino's film was 2 hours long. It was already long enough. And
it was closer to 3, I think.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, it was long. And there's a lot more to it than that. He said, that
Jay and Sharon were side characters, and Quentin really did everything that he could to show them.
Well, as he says in that documentary, he goes, I want people to like them. They're not victims. I want them to like Jay, who was a likable guy, and I want them to like Sharon. So I think he accomplished his goal, even though they were never meant to be main characters in that movie. For us, they kind of are main characters. There's 3 principles. Terry's the namesake, because Terry's story has never been told correctly from any angle. And then we have Jay and Sharon, who were also maligned after their deaths and made.
Well, Jay and Sharon are very important characters. In fact, they appear for literally all the episodes, first 6 episodes, I believe. And we're literally exploring their life. And I believe the 3rd episode of 1969 might eventually change it to 2 episodes, cover 1969 in 2 episodes. It leads straight to press coverage, just reporting the crimes. So we're really showing things as to how they lived, how people remembered them, and what people actually witnessed, because we're not going to focus on the few recollections given by the killers as to what happened. No. We're not interested in that. And those last few moments of their lives do not speak any truth to who they were as people. So
no. Although I think we can say, because
so that's why.
Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Sorry, that's why these stories are really important. These little details with hair, and just the Sebring methods, everything. It's these little details that make all the difference, and it's going to make all the difference with the series and in showcasing Jay scenes. So Tim and I, we want to eventually find a way to reach out to Anthony and Joe and see if we could interview them. They're welcome and invited to join and come along. But if not, I would be happy nonetheless to just email them privately and just maybe when the time comes, share them like the scene packs of where Jay's included, all of Jay's scenes, just to gain further approval, just to make sure that they're happy with everything, because this is a public figure. So I just do know that even though his life, I suppose, is in the public domain, I do want to reach out to the families and make sure that they approve and they're happy with everything.
Well, that is the stand-up way to do it. And that's what the Salacious Productions have never bothered to do. And another important detail about Jay is he wasn't just kind to big shots. He wasn't just kind to A-list actors and actresses and famous people. His friend Paul Greenwald in the documentary tells a kind of a cool story about it. And Paul was the electrician who did the wiring at Jay's Easton Drive house when he moved in, set it up for cable and the lights and all that. And the story he tells of first meeting Jay, when he in the documentary, he says he remembers it very well. He was just a kid, underage, 17 or 18. Jay took him into the house, showed him around the property, and showed him what he wanted done. And then either that night or later on, he took him out to a restaurant on Sunset Boulevard called the Cock and Bull, which was an English-style pub. It's no longer there; it's been gone forever.
Whoa.
But he's cool. Sitting there. He takes Paul to this restaurant, and he's just a kid, and Jay is already a pretty big deal by that point. And they sit down and they order food, and then the waitress says, "Do you want anything to drink?" And Jay goes, "Yeah, 2 buds." And he says, "Don't say anything." So he was kind of like the cool uncle, you know.
That's fair.
He befriended Paul as a kid, kind of took him under his wing, gave him work. So it was not like he was just sucking up to big shots. You know, he was kind to everybody. And Paul said that in that document all those years later. And then, of course, Paul introduced him to Alvin, his father, and Alvin became his lawyer. And Alvin became critical in putting together the legislation and the legal documents to effect the change in the barber industry so that cosmetologists could work alongside the barbers. So he fostered a lot of important relationships outside of people who were famous. And in that documentary, his own siblings, which you would expect, spoke very highly of him. He's got, I think, 1 brother and 2 sisters. They spoke, very well of Jay. They said, he was, and you can obviously tell, listening to Anthony talk, especially in these recent interviews, which I think were on something called the Paulcast. You can look them up. They're not hard to find on YouTube. You can tell by the way Anthony talks about this stuff, even all these years later, that he's still very passionate about it, and it still affects him and his family very much, because they've had to live with, their relative being misrepresented by the mass media for years. And what I would think will happen, and what I'm hoping will happen, was when the book comes out, it's a companion piece to the documentary. It's due out in I think July in the States. It will help to set that record straight even more about who Jay really was. And who he really was a pretty great guy based on all the people who knew him and have talked about him.
Yeah. And I think we also want to hear from people that were closest to him rather than anyone who's just out to get their money's worth. We actually like and admire and respect the fact that someone like Anthony was close to him, or, Joe worked with him, because these guys have stories. These guys were close to him, and we know that they respect him. They respect Jay and his legacy. So they're going to be informative and set the record straight over a few things and kind of undo all the damage that's been done over the years. So we're definitely looking forward to his book. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing any more interviews or anything that these guys have put out online relating to Jay, because I just know that they just have the best stories. And I think this is how we should honor and remember Jay.
Yeah. And not to get salacious, but there is something based on medical evidence that kind of is testifies to the kind of guy Jay was. Another way that Jay was slandered later after he died was that he was a coward and was cowering in a corner, didn't fight back against the killers. Well, medical evidence, as discussed, and not to go into the details too much, but medical and toxicology evidence that's presented in the documentary based on the wounds on Jay's body shows that he did go after the killers. He tried to stop what was going on, and there's medical and forensic evidence to testify to that fact. So he was not a coward. In the last minutes of his life, he was trying to prevent what happened from happening, and he was not going to let, as Stephen Kay says, the prosecutor in the documentary, he says that nothing bad was going to happen to Sharon. If he loved her, he was going to protect her with his dying breath, and that's what he did. So even in those last few moments, Jay was a stand-up guy. So it's important for people to know that too.
It's not just that. I mean, I think even in the documentary, they briefly do mention, what the press did out of all this. And it was a quick montage clip of the same film portrayal over and over again. Jay's final words being, "Can't you see she's pregnant?" And then text him. just shotgun after each take from like different film mediums.
Yeah, no, that's not what happened. He was shot
Those
once.
were just a very few seconds of the documentary, and it literally made me sick to my stomach. Like, I do not want to see that again. I do not want to see anything relative to that again. So I think it's about time that we kind of stop reducing Jay Sebring into just, a victim of the Manson family and that, because it's just, I think when you really look into him, Manson's name really holds no value or importance.
What he only lived to be 35. What he did in 35 years was astounding, especially what he did in the last 10 years of his life is astonishing. He went from flat broken and nobody to the most important men's hairstylist probably in the world, and was a confidant, friend, and client of all these big time movie stars and TV stars. They were all either friends or clients or both. And that's testifying to the kind of guy that he was. If he couldn't be trusted, if he was selling secrets to the press, to the gossip columnists, they wouldn't have had anything to do with him. So the fact that he held their confidences for so many years and they thought so highly of him,
that's something, yeah,
to the point where a lot of them were investing in his future, that speaks highly to who he was and the integrity of the man. And it's interesting to think about. And even some of the people in the documentary said, where would he be today? That's an interesting, it's impossible to speculate, but just how far would he have gone? He'd be about 90 if he would have lived to present day, but say he lived another 30 years, 40 years. It's interesting to think about how far he could have taken the product line, the flagship shop, and all the satellite shops that he planned to open all over the world. San Francisco was a definite go. That was weeks, if not days, away from being opened in the summer of '69. He was eyeing London, like you said, other places in Europe, Honolulu. He really had kind of a worldwide vision for where he wanted. New York City, yeah, where he wanted to take the Sebring method and the Sebring school of hair design, because he was a designer of men's hair, not a barber. Like you said early in the show, he kind of looked at what was right for your face and gave you a cut based on that structure so that you looked your best. That's an artist. That's a stylist. That's not a barber.
Exactly.
And he started all that. And the people who apprenticed under him give him credit for that.
I don't remember if it was Larry or who it was, but like, those guys that were saying that before, it was just like 5 chairs and 5 guys sitting on chairs and 5 barbers giving you a bad cut. Like that was
his friend. That was his friend Charles Champlin, who was a writer for the LA Times. I think he was one of Jay's first clients. He was funny. He's like, yeah,
catchy.
Cutting hair for men used to be 5 guys cutting in a row, cutting hair badly. And Jay just upended that.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden, he was commanding all these super high prices for back then, and people were paying it. And that, of course, upset the barbers who were making $2 a cut. But they also weren't artists. They weren't putting in the diligence and the time and the effort into a cut that Jay was.
Yeah.
And Jay taught all of his pupils, Larry, Joe, on down the line, how to do that. And not only that, he gives them credit for teaching them the other side of that business, which is dealing with people. I think it was Joe who said, he taught us how to talk to people, particularly powerful people, what to say, what not to say, what topics to discuss, what not to discuss, to keep things professional but still friendly. That was a big part of Jay's teaching. He wanted to make sure that his pupils knew how to interact with people and where the boundaries should be kept and how to safeguard their privacy, particularly in the cases of people being famous and him not wanting to give away their secrets or any kind of salacious gossip. And because he safeguarded that, they trusted him. And then they trusted the people that he taught. So yeah, his influence was wide and far. And credit to him for being a maverick and for being a visionary and having the guts to say, no, I'm going to go out and try this thing in California. I don't want to stay home. I have to take a chance. I want to do this. And he was determined to do it.
And what's also very interesting is that there are a few clips from the instructional film that he commissioned 10 years into his career that were available on YouTube, which I have watched in the past. And I found very interesting to teach and explain his method. So I do think that he just does deserve to be remembered as not only, the founder, should I say one of the founding fathers, if I'm brave enough to say that, of the men's hairstyling industry, but also a household name. And had he lived longer, he would be a household name, definitely so, because he would have just gone way more into it with Sebring International. But even though his life was cut short, I think he still ought to be remembered as a household name. So do you have any finishing statements that you'd like to add for Jay today?
Well, again, this is our whole goal with this and the series and everything else is to, as we've talked about on and off for many years, is that we want to portray the lives of these people in the correct way, meaning not the way that people have turned the end of their lives into a cottage industry / cash machine, but to look at the lives they've lived. And I think we're on the right track with that. We've done that for Terry, Sharon, and now Jay. And Jay's life is what he accomplished, like we've been talking about, is overshadowed by the way his life ended. Most people don't know anything about this stuff, about the influence he had on the men's hairstyling industry and how he started the trends that continue to this day and which have allowed the business to generate so much money. I think it's entirely possible that had he lived, he would have gone on to be someone on the level of like Vidal Sassoon or some of the other big shot female hair designers. I think had he lived, he would have risen to that level. He would have taken the product line to a whole new level. It would have been everywhere. He would have branched out with the schooling all over the world. I think his potential really was limitless as to just how far he wanted to take it. Of course, it's impossible to say, but he does need to be remembered as the founder of that industry and as for someone who just had a lot of guts and a lot of class and who cultivated the attention and the business of some very powerful people and kept them in his orbit because he was trustworthy and because they dug him. Like Quentin said, he just dug him. He was a likable guy. I think also I do want to thank everybody who's watched so far. The episodes we've done, we've developed quite a pretty good little audience here for these things. In the beginning, Tina and I weren't even sure we were going to broadcast these because Tina was going to use these to help her write. But we found that
I would happily broadcast these because I'm one of those people where I think if someone's going to help you in life, they're just going to help you and acknowledge you. I know that there's a lot of people that are just observers of social media where they just observe everything you're doing, but they don't approach you, speak to you, acknowledge you. So I've learned long enough, it's been a long time coming, many years now, to not really care about who sees my work. I'm just putting this out there for myself. I believe if you actually have a look at my Twitter account and you scroll through it, for the most part, it's a mess of a research. If you just type in the search engine on my profile, you write codes, Jay Sebring, Terry, whatever, you'll just find research. So with me, it's just about the way I use it. But I am happy because I've had people on Instagram messaging me as well, letting me know that.
Well, the comments on the YouTube videos are, for the most part, very positive. And to my surprise, there's an audience for this perspective on these times, which in the United States, we've been fed the true crime crap for so long. And we've only been exposed to these people as victims that I kind of doubted that there would be any kind of interest in the other side of the story. But based on the comments we've gotten on these videos, there is interest. And people are saying things like, I'm so glad you're covering things that aren't related to the crimes. Or this is the most in-depth look at Sharon Tate that I've ever seen. That's really gratifying to us. In the comments or the description of this video, Tina will include our social media handles if you want to check us out. Our pages, Instagram, Twitter. Particularly Tina's Twitter is very good for the research end of this stuff. There's no better researcher anywhere than Tina. So if you want more
information. Tim, even if there wasn't an audience, for this, it's my job to create an audience for it. It's our job to create an audience for it because I believe and I think you know this better than I do, if you actually look at the film industry today and all the content that's getting produced in the US, which by the way, is the most influential film market in terms of, global success and global recognition and awareness. Yep. So we have to credit that the American film industry is the strongest. I think, out of most, no matter what they try to say about European cinema or whatever. But here's the thing. What's the phrase? Like, they'll get bullshit and sprinkle it and make it look perfect. I mean, they make so many unnecessary films, spend millions promoting all these BS films. And in fact, we're not getting monetized for these videos, so we're actually allowed to curse. That's something I have to mention. We're just not cursing on it.
Well, you should have said that 10 videos ago. Goddamn.
So, you know, we hear people like Sydney Sweeney developing a film that she stole off of Reddit. Not
well, I think she paid for it, but
she was inspired, and it was a Reddit story that she took and she's developing, which is great. Sorry, I think you're getting cut off on my end. Okay, we'll keep this video short because I don't want to, but you know, there's people, you know, with no really creative input. There's so many people making unnecessary films. I'm not even going to name any more names. You know, there's people giving talks and interviews about films that they're making, and they brand them as indie or whatever, but there's so many financiers behind them. So I'm not actually interested because there's so much content that is just useless and meaningless. And this is a series about Terry Melcher, a music producer in the 1960s who had an amazing story of his own. He was a son of Doris Day as well. There's so many great stories. This guy, I don't know if you can see this photo where he's having dinner with Dean Martin, and
that's worth bringing up.
Used to have dinners with Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, and has a lot of stories because his mom was Doris Day. So, and here's another beautiful photo of the two, Terry with his mom. So there's so many interesting characters, and I think just today, managing to bring Jay to light as to the best effect as we could as possible, and the best degree, I guess. There's so many interesting characters. There's so many insights. There's so many hidden storylines, which shift the attention away from the Manson family, and we can actually elaborate on stories that haven't been told. So.
Well, Jay's whole life story basically
an audience for this. Yeah. So I think what I wanted to say was Tim and I weren't so sure that there was an audience, but I think nonetheless, because I will say that I would have posted these anyway for myself, for the sake of myself, to know that, you know, these videos are informative. They're for me as well, for Tim and I to discuss and think about things and have discussions later on while writing and developing the screenplay. Which will be covered in 10 episodes, is the following, is that even if no one was interested in this, because even if no one was interested in Terry Melcher, because no one has actually even done a documentary on him or anything about his life, or even
Anthony's was the first on Jay.
Yes, exactly.
It took 50 years.
And that's a starting point. But the thing is, it's my job as the writer and developer to create an audience for this. Because there's so much nonsense that's being made, that I see that's made every year, every few months in the film industry. So there's actually nothing stopping me from doing this. And,
and it's a story that needs to be told and has never been told in this way. That's the hook.
And no also
bothered to do it.
Yes. And also, without mentioning too much, because I have had producers tell me that you have to be experienced and keep an eye out for people that talk too much crap. So there's a producer that I know who tells me that because he goes to Cannes every year, he says, like, you have to instantly identify who's all chit chatter and doesn't actually end up networking and because everyone tries to showcase themselves at Cannes. But luckily enough, I decided to go to Cannes this year. I am going with people I know, but I also will be introduced to people I don't know and doing some networking.
Which is fantastic. Yeah, that's so excited to hear how that goes.
Yeah, so Miss Kilberg is trying to meet producers and trying to pitch the idea without giving it away in its entirety, just to see
this is how this stuff is done.
Interested in staying in touch.
That'll be really fun to talk about your experience there, because going there is a big deal. That's still one of the premier film fest, maybe the premier film festival.
I wish you could join me.
It would be something. Yeah, maybe in the future we can do that. We can go there. But no, this is like we've said in other videos. This is a passion project for us, and like to make it clear, We don't have, neither one of us has any direct affiliation with anybody that we're talking about or their families. This is just a story that has touched us, and it hit us both the same way, as in, why has nobody bothered to tell their story beyond the way they died when their lives are fascinating, completely independent of that? I mean, Jay's life reads like a script because it's so improbable on some levels. You know, a guy with no connections, no ins to Hollywood, takes a chance, rolls the dice, moves out there, opens a shop, and becomes the biggest hairstylist for men in the world. That's a movie right there. Just Jay's life story. And please note, we haven't mentioned anything in that about how he died. So it hit us in the same ways. We need to tell this story from the perspective, from a positive perspective of their lives. And we've also been talking about, you know, Jay appearing in his last scene in the series. And it's a really cool effect I think we're working on, or kind of like our one for Sharon. Without saying too much, the music we've picked out and the way we're going to shoot it, I think is going to be really cool. And it's going to leave people with a positive impression of these people. Like where they were here, they were alive, they were with us, they accomplished a lot, their lives were cut short. Let's remember them in a positive way.
Yes. And like we have mentioned in the past, or, you know, at least when we did the Sharon Tate segment, you know, portraying a person and showing them, or even the actor who's playing the character, through a version of their death or anticipating death and expecting death, that is the most limiting version of legacy. So
Sure.
You're not going to elaborate or ever learn anything about someone's life if all you're doing is showcasing and portraying how they died and those last few moments, because those few moments do not speak any truth to how they were as people and how they lived. So we're hoping that this session, we're almost reaching an hour and a half, so I do want to end the recording soon.
That went quick. It always does.
So so I hope that people enjoyed this session on Jay. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to gain more insights on him and have more stories to share.
Again, and again, Tina will include in the descriptions our social media handles if you want to follow us. Also, there will be a link. There will be a link. Not to shill too much for my own stuff, but if you can't be a proper YouTuber unless you shill a little bit. She will also put a link to my book, my ebook on Barnes & Noble, which is basically a collection of essays about all things entertainment from the 60s, movies, films, TV stars. There's quite a few on Sharon. There's a few on Jay. There's a bunch on the Times. If you want to check it out, it's available at the link that she'll talk about. For anyone who's interested in delving deeper, these are essays that I've written over about the last 6 years as inspiration came to me. And a lot of the essays in this book have to do with exactly what we're talking about. So check out Tina's Twitter, my Instagram, her Instagram, and the link
also,
if you want
Tim,
more information.
I believe you sent me an email covering all these things, your links, right, for future podcasts.
Yes, they should be in there. Yep.
Perfect.
If anyone wants to check that out. And other thing I should mention, Tina and I, when we write from our own hearts and our own heads and our own hands. We do not use AI. We do not use ChatGPT. Everything I have written in my book and everywhere else is from my own head. I don't use Grammarly. I don't use any of that stuff. Number one, I think it's a cheat. And
I certainly don't use ChatGPT to write my screenplay. Only discovered ChatGPT last summer, and I've been working on this screenplay for years. And not to mention, like, it's kind of offensive. ChatGPT kind of goes against the programming or future doctors. Tim.
No, everything we write everything ourselves.
Yeah, it goes against, working your ass off to get 2 degrees and, writing all of that and learning about critical thinking and things. So
you can rest assured,
Tim and I do not use.
No, we refuse. And let's be honest, even if I wanted to use it, I'm too old to probably know how to use it. So that's
we're disappearing. We're disappearing and we're kind of lagging. So I believe this is a good time to end.
Okay, very good.
If I can hear you on your end.
There's your blue lights. There's the
lights. The lights are a sign.
The lights are a sign. So yes, thank you, Anthony. Thank you. We dedicate this episode to the DeMaria family, Jay's living relatives. Yep. I hear you. You're frozen, but I can see you. Can you still hear the audio? Looks like maybe this
Hello?
yeah, I can hear you. Are you there? Oh, there you are. Okay, you're back. A couple final thoughts. Thank you to Anthony.
Hi, sorry,
and to the,
Tim. Your image is frozen and the connection is really bad, so I think it would just be a safe to end things from here. So I'll just end the
okay, very good.
recording
Thanks
and
for everyone who
hopefully
watched.
be
Please
good.
continue to watch. We'll be doing Laurel Canyon next.